2, I want to talk to you about the definition of the word abstraction. I've asked you to work abstractly on your sketches, and so we need to talk about exactly what that means. Abstraction is a word that's easiest to define in reference to its opposite, representation. So we're going to be looking at the work of some artists and designers and seeing how they use abstraction and representation in their work. We're going to start with one of my favorite painters, Edward Hopper. I'd like you to take a look at this. When I ask my students what they see in this painting, what's going on in this painting, I get a lot of different answers, and I'd like you to think about the answer to that yourself for just a moment before I start talking. So I'll say that when I ask students what they see, often the first thing that I hear is that they see a man and a woman, and they see a dog. And if I try to draw them out a little bit more, they'll often begin talking about the relationships between the man, the woman, and the dog. Are the man and the woman a couple? Are they enjoying a peaceful vacation evening in their summer home? Are they angry at each other because of the way the woman has her arms folded, perhaps? Are they focusing on the dog? Is the man calling the dog or offering the dog a treat? What does the dog see outside of the canvas? Right, so these are all things that I think it's probably pretty easy for most of you to identify with, and questions that you might have asked yourself when I asked you, what is going on in this painting? Then as we perhaps begin to look a little further through the painting, and I might ask my students what more they see, I often hear people begin to talk about the house, the trees behind the house, the setting, the time of year, the weather, the time of day. The title of the painting, of course, is a clue that it's evening, but also the darkness over here on the left side of the painting gives us the feeling, perhaps, that the day is ending, that shadows are beginning to accumulate in the background. The fact that the trees seem to be growing out of this feature of the landscape down here, and that the dog is standing in it, makes most people think that this is some kind of grass. People never seem to think that this is sand, although it's sandy in color. And although it's Cape Cod, they never seem to think that it's a driveway. They always think that this is grass, some kind of a meadow full of a tall grass, because of the way the dog's legs and the people's feet are concealed, and also because of the strokes. Often people, when I ask them why they think this is grass, what they see that makes them say this is grass, they'll talk about the diagonal strokes. They'll talk about these little bands of darker color as opposed to lighter color. Often people will say, oh, it's late summer because there's still a little bit of green in the grass, but it's starting to turn brown, especially out here where it's in the sun. Back here under the trees, there's a lot more green in the grass. So as we begin talking about the things that we see that give us this feeling of grass or time of day, that sort of thing, we begin talking more and more about abstract considerations, things like color, things like stroke direction, things like contrast. And although these, of course, are the same features that we see when we talk about a dog or a woman or whether her arms are folded or not, we begin maybe as we go out into these less figurative areas of the painting, we begin to talk more about the abstract, the formal considerations. So let's do a little experiment here. I'd like you to look at the lower right-hand corner of the painting only. This is cropped right out of the painting. The dog is up here, the people are up here, but they're gone now. Would you know that this was grass? Some people say yes, some people say no, and there's no right answer to this. And of course, your minds are now biased because you've seen this little crop in context. But I would suggest that to many people, if you simply saw this part of the painting, you wouldn't know that it was grass, because we depend on context for a lot of the things that make certain brush marks certain color combinations, certain fairly abstract movements of a painter's brush look like something. In this version of the picture, it looks like grass. When the picture's cropped, maybe not quite so much. It's a little bit more abstract, a little bit more purely about form and color, a little bit less representational. Let's look at another Hopper painting. Again, I'm going to give you a chance to look at this for a moment and tell yourself what you think this painting is about, what you see, what's going on here. Now, when I ask my students typically what this painting is about, the first few answers I get are typically about the two women who are depicted in the front of the painting here. These two women, most people think they're women, sitting at a table. Most people believe that it's a table in a restaurant, and when I ask them what they see that makes them say that, they say, well, there's another table and there's another couple seated there. I get people speculating on the story. Are these two women meeting to talk over their day? Are they having tea together? Is this a date? Is this a business meeting? The guy's wearing a suit. What time of day is it? What time of year is it? That sort of thing. In fact, most of what I hear when I ask people to talk about what the painting is about, most of what I hear has reference to the lower left-hand corner of the painting. And as you see, if we look back at the rest of the painting, there's a lot more. In fact, the people take up only about a quarter of the acreage of this painting. There's a lot of other stuff going on, and a lot of it is depicting things. For example, most people think that this is meant to be a coat here. Most people think this is meant to be a window. This is meant to be a window. People notice that the painting is named Chop Suey, and they think that this may be a sign for a Chinese restaurant, and that this is a table in the restaurant. They now see that this must be green tea, and so forth. So the rest of this acreage out here that we haven't talked about much yet does help tell the story, but in some ways it's much more abstract. Some parts of it in particular are very abstract. For example, this is one of my favorite parts of the painting. This fairly scuzzy, scummy, messy, finger-painted looking part of the painting is seen in context as to be maybe a steamy window, or a window that has some kind of paper sunlight barrier on it. People aren't quite sure what it is, but they're sure that Hopper intended it to be something, that there was something there that he was responding to, because he goes to quite a lot of trouble to overpaint a sign that he had painted in some detail, apparently, before he painted the window over it. Very abstract all by itself, but it plays its part in the representation when you see it in the whole painting. I'm going to look at another Hopper painting here, and by this time I'm sure you're on to me. When I ask you what this painting is about, you may at first notice the sailboat and the lighthouse and the sandy beach. These are all the first things that people mention to me when I say what's going on in this painting. But then often they begin to talk about the currents in the water. They're noticing that in some places the waves are painted with a little bit more light and dark, and in some places we see almost a feeling that wind is not rippling the surface quite as much. So this gives us a feeling of the wind, the weather. Thinking about the weather makes us move up into the sky and feel the gradient here and the light that seems to be coming from the left. So all these things, some of them are abstract concerns, a brushstroke, a feeling of contrast, a gradient. Some of them are so intensely representational, a boat, that we don't really start talking about it usually in terms of formal considerations, but we talk about it in terms of the object that's being referred to by the painter's use of paint. Now let's do a little experiment here and crop off the things that you wouldn't perhaps mention right away when asked what this painting is about. If I ask you what this painting is about and you simply say it's about a boat, and a lighthouse and some little buildings and sand and water and some sky, then I could crop this painting just like this, and it would still be about the same stuff. But, of course, it's not at all the same painting, right? In fact, this is not nearly as good a painting, in my opinion, as this one is. This painting makes me feel kind of cramped, and it doesn't seem to have the light, it doesn't seem to have the wind, it doesn't seem to have the weather, it doesn't have that feeling of freedom, of being out on the water, looking at another boat. It's not at all the painting that this one is. Because in this painting, Hopper has subconsciously, I'm sure, I don't think Hopper had a rule for how big he was going to make a sky or how much acreage on the canvas he was going to devote to the water. He was following his own intuition, but his intuition, because of his masterful compositional abilities, his intuition led him to expand the sky and the water in his conception of the composition, and to give them a very, very large place, which we miss if we see them cropped out. So when we talk about issues like balance, like how big to make a shape, we're talking about abstract considerations. And whenever painters work to represent something on a canvas, those abstract considerations are always there. For some painters, they're bigger than they are for other painters. Some painters really focus on depiction. Some painters focus more on abstraction or abstract concerns. And some painters change their minds about that throughout their lives, or even go back and forth. Let's look at the work of Richard Diebenkorn, painter from California, obviously depicting some objects here, although when I ask my students what's going on in this painting, I get a lot of different answers, some of them a little bit contradictory. Most people tell me that they see a chair here, and a book, and a glass, and a table. Most people tell me that they see a room, a corner of a room, and that these are windows, and they're looking out at some kind of a landscape, although I have had people tell me that this was wallpaper, and that these stripes of green and blue were painted on or were affixed somehow to walls. Most people, however, think these are windows, and that they're looking out, that this is a landscape, and that these blue rectangles here that you see through window panes are meant to represent sky. Some people, however, think that this is an oceanside landscape and that that's water. And I've even had people say that this blue here is the underside of an awning that sticks out from these windows and shades this room. I would never have thought that myself, but once I heard that, I can't get it out of my mind. It seems possible to me that that is the underside of an awning. Now, you may vote strongly for sky. I don't know, and I can't ask Diebenkorn right now, but the point is that those blue rectangles seem to be painted largely for their glorious blue color, largely for the resonance that they have with the walls and the table down here. And Diebenkorn wasn't as careful as he might have been to tell us exactly what he means them to be. He left them just a little bit indistinct. Same with the landscape here. He didn't paint this landscape in great detail. If it is a landscape, and I believe it is, it seems to be very sun-drenched, seems to have some kind of grass growing on it, or maybe some sand. A little unclear about that, but it's painted rather swiftly. And I'd like you to look real quick here at the table, too, before we go on. What would it have felt like to paint that table? If you had to paint that table exactly the way it's painted, how would you do it? I think the strokes that he used were very rapid, and yet I think he spent some time on it, because I think he painted it this sort of orangey brown. You can see a little bit of another color coming through the blue, and then I think he let it dry enough that he could paint another color over it. very, very rapidly and letting some of that orange show through. Why would you paint something that way if you just meant it to say table to people? Can't answer that question, but I'd like you to ask yourself. And let's take a look at one of the paintings that Diebenkorn did, I would say probably somewhere in the order of 10 or 15 years after that painting we just looked at. These are the paintings that really made him famous, I think. The abstract, purely abstract paintings that he made in the 70s. And you see here that this blue has not fallen out of favor with Diebenkorn. He still is using the blues, the yellows, the whites. He still is using rectangles. He still is using the simple shapes that he used to depict that interior and that landscape. He's still using this technique of painting a shape one color, letting it dry a bit, and then putting another color over it and letting you see down. He's using that feeling of layering. He's using very rapid brushwork. In fact, he's using all the same abstract approaches, the same formal concerns are all still there. All he's left behind, really, is the depiction. He's not depicting anything. I'd like to show you a couple of paintings by Paul Cézanne because he is one of the painters, one of the main painters, I'd say, working in the late 1800s, over 100 years ago. He is one of the first who gave artists permission to go beyond depiction and to highlight abstract, formal concerns in a painting. He was willing to paint in a way that during his time seemed lacking in skill, lacking in finish, in order to show us the formal things that interested him about the scene that he was looking at. So he didn't concern himself, perhaps, with whether the bottle that he depicted was absolutely symmetrical or whether the linear perspective was absolutely correct. He didn't put a lot of careful depiction into the modeling, although he does use some light and shade. He puts a lot of liveliness and movement into the pattern on the cloth. He emphasizes the brushstroke that he's using, and he gives you much more of a feeling of the artist himself standing there working on the painting rather than trying to hide his tracks and emphasize the depiction of the objects. Here's a landscape of a mountain that he loved to paint and painted over and over again. And again here you see, as he works on the bushes and the vegetation in the foreground, you see his brushstroke emphasized. You can make that motion that he made with your own hand and feel what it would have felt like to paint this painting, possibly very rapidly. If you get to see Cézanne paintings in real life, you'll see that there are often patches in the painting where the canvas shows through, where the paint is so thin that he's allowed the canvas to show through. In other words, he's not trying to pretend that this is a mountain and that you're looking at a hillside. He's letting you know, frankly, that you're looking at a painting. And he's painting just enough to indicate the representation that he wants, but he's not trying to duplicate it or to trick you into anything. He's showing you what he's doing as he does it. Cézanne and other painters who were working at that time, beginning to paint more expressively, beginning to let their paint show as paint, really opened up possibilities for painters, so that nowadays it's possible for a painter to paint a portrait, for example, in a way that really emphasizes the paint as much as the portrait. When I ask my students what they see in this painting, what they feel is going on here, most people agree that this is a painting of a human being. Most people think it's a man. Some people even think that this is a beard, although most people think it's a shadow under his chin. Some people think that this is a dark shirt that he's wearing. Many people think, though, that this is a hand that he has raised up towards his throat. Most people think these are eyes, and that's a mouth, this is a nose. But we're pretty much hardwired to see the human face in anything that looks vaguely round and has two dots on it. So David Park in this painting is giving us the absolute minimum, pretty much, that we need to see the human face. Now, why, in your opinion, would anybody paint a human being this way? When I ask my students that, I've gotten lots of different answers, some very interesting. Some people think he painted this person this way because he was painting from memory or from a dream, and he couldn't recall the specific details of the face. Some people think he painted his model this way, if there was a model, because of some emotional feeling that he felt towards the model, anger or dislike. Some people have suggested that it's a self-portrait, and I don't know the answer to that one. It possibly could be. And that he painted himself this way because he felt sad or melancholy. People start talking about the colors that they see. The rainbow of blues, this very clear, bright blue, this intense blue, this gray blue, these purpley grays in the face. People say that they have a reaction of sadness or melancholy when they see that range of blues. Now, I can't tell you what the right answer is. There are no shoulds when it comes to what you should think about a painting. You get to think what you want to think. And when a painter puts a painting out there in the world, he has to let go, in some ways, of what people will think of it and what it will say to them. But it's an interesting question to ask. The answer to that question is going to be full of abstract considerations. It's going to be full of opinions about how you put paint on, what paint is, what it does, what it can mean. This is a painting by Franz Klein, an abstract painter, abstract expressionist painter. Painters of this school tried to completely keep any kind of figuration or representation out of their work. They tried to compose their pictures in purely abstract terms and to make the painting something that was opaque, that you couldn't see through into another world. Your view of the painting ends at the surface of the painting, begins and ends there. And the only reference to anything outside of the painting might possibly be to the painter's body itself, to the energy and the gesture of the painter as he or she worked on the painting. And yet I still get people, when I show them this painting, I still get lots of people telling me that they see some kind of a barrier here with a person behind it. See, this orange person is doing, his back is to us. He's doing something behind a fence. Or they'll tell me it's a wall. These are stones, and these are the mortar between the stones. Or they'll tell me they see an eye here and a mouth. It's very, very difficult to paint anything that people can't see some kind of representation in. Here's another Franz Klein. Almost everyone tells me they see bridges or scaffolding, some kind of fence in this painting. And yet I believe that Klein intended it to be completely abstract. Here's a painting by a painter who works on a very, very interesting edge between abstraction and representation. And I'd like to look at a few paintings like that because I think that the most interesting thing about this dialectic, abstraction versus representation, is the way that painters often like to play with it and the material that they get out of it, the expression that they find in their place on that continuum. So let's look at this. I'm going to ask you to think for just a moment about what's going on in this painting, what you see, before I bias your mind with reactions other people have given to me. Okay, well, I'll say that many, many people, when they see this painting, tell me that this is a sunset and that this is the sun. Often people tell me that this is a path, but by no means always. Some people tell me that this is a stream, a river. Some people say that this is water, and some people say that this is a desert and that this is a mirage or an oasis. Some people say that these are cows lying in a field at sunset. Some people say that these are clouds in the sky and that the sky continues down to the horizon here. Some people say that these are people. Some people say that these are leaves or things blowing in the wind. I had somebody tell me that they thought that this was a duck floating on a pond, and that this was and also another little duck or swan or stork or something. And ever since then, I haven't been able to see this as anything besides water. I've had people tell me that this is a scene from another planet, from Mars, from some planet that has weather unlike ours. I've had people say that this is the moon and that this is the night sky. The fact that it is orange did not faze them at all. Although most people see some kind of a landscape here. There's very little agreement, in my opinion or in my experience, about exactly what we're looking at. And that's clearly something that the painter wasn't worried about, right? The painter could have painted this landscape, presumably, a lot more clearly than he did. Why would he paint it this way? Often people suggest to me that he was painting from life, and that the sun was setting, or that the weather was changing, or that he didn't have much time, and so that he had to paint it very, very rapidly. Some people suggest that he was painting from memory, and he couldn't be any clearer because his memory wasn't any clearer. I don't know why, but I know that this way of painting feels very expressive to me, and it puts me in touch with his, I don't know how to put it, his soul, his feelings, his moment of standing there at the canvas in a way that a much more carefully painted work might not. Let's look at another John Walker here. This is a print, an etching, and when I ask people what they see or what's going on in it, I get many, many different answers again. Most people see some kind of a bird here because of the beak-like formation. A lot of people say this is a skull. They say that it's a skull and that these are bones, therefore, that there's some kind of crushed or deformed or half decomposed skeletal remains. But not everybody says that. Some people say that this is a human wearing a mask, and that the grotty sort of way that it's painted is symbolic of some kind of oppression or misery that this human is undergoing. Some people notice these scratches here and say that they indicate motion, that the person is struggling to get out of some kind of bondage. After a while, people begin to talk about these very, very crisp rectilinear forms in the background. And some people suggest that they look like crosses, or maybe probably because they have the idea of a skull in their minds, they think maybe they look like tombstones or something from a cemetery, some kind of ritual. We never end up with any agreement about what exactly is depicted in this picture, and yet things are clearly being depicted, right? They're just not being depicted clearly. Why would Walker do this? What is it that he likes about this technique he seems to have of depicting things but not quite clearly enough that you know what's in his mind? Often people tell me that they think he likes to raise questions. He likes to evoke a feeling of some kind of an object or a subject, but he doesn't like to answer the questions. He likes to leave those questions in your mind and to disturb you in some way, you, the viewer, to leave you a little bit unsatisfied or a little bit questioning still. Frank Stella was so interested in pure abstraction, in complete cutting off of any kind of reference or representation, that he actually shaped his canvases. And I'm going to just show you the shadow here that you see in this kind of lavender negative shape. This is the wall, and these shadows are cast by the painting, which is really a very, very shallow piece of sculpture. The canvas, in other words, is shaped to the outside edge of the painting. The painting is completely made up of these very hard-edged forms, which he would have probably masked with masking tape. So the painting is purely about shapes and colors. Our eyes are not meant to look through this painting as if it were a window into another world in his imagination. Our eyes are meant to stop at the painting, I believe. However, many, many people do see depictions here, and they'll see a chair falling to the right. They'll see a house. They'll see buildings. I've even had people say they see a church. So the idea that to completely eliminate depiction, especially in an interesting painting, is very, very difficult. Here's another painting by Paul Klee. I showed you a work of his in a previous lecture. And again, when I ask people what's going on here, what they see, most people start talking about objects, real objects in the world that are being referred to. People will say they see the moon. Some people see it here, some people see it here. When I ask them how there can be two moons, they simply say, well, it's a painting, right? There can be anything. Some people say they see trees. Some people say they see a boat here and this is a lake. Some of these trees, some people see as mountains. How can the mountains be above the moon? Ah, it's a painting, right? Some people say they see a city here. Some people say that they see a building with little windows, with a little tiny gable roof over each window. But some people say, no, this is an orchard with a fence around it. These are little trees. But this is a tree. But these are trees, right? What Klee is doing here is working with shape and color. Very, very simple means. He's taking really about 3 or 4 shapes. He's taking the triangle, the rectangle, a sort of a lozenge or almond shape, and a circle. And he's repeating them, he's overlapping them, he's subtly coloring them to bring some of them out and to push some of them back, and creating a whole very, very beautiful dream world, a dream city, he says, out of these very, very simple shapes. These shapes, for most of us, are the very, very first shapes that we ever drew with, and I'm sure you've all done a drawing as a child where you take a rectangle and you put a triangle on top of it and you say it's a house. And he's used that same simple technique to make a very, very beautiful and expressive painting. It hovers on the edge between abstraction and representation. Another favorite painter of mine, René Magritte, painter from the Surrealist school, but there's nobody quite like Magritte. When I ask people what's going on in this painting, they almost always talk about the imagery, the representation. So they'll say, there's a guy there, and there's an apple, but the apple's kind of hovering in front of his face. Why? And they may talk about different features of the man as they look more and more closely. They'll say that he has a red necktie, his hand is almost the same color of red, but the other hand is very dark, very hard to see. They'll talk about his bowler hat, they'll talk about the odd color of his face, they'll talk about the way he's dressed as if he were going to work at a bank or something. Very, very little about the way the painting is painted. Eventually, they may talk about the fact that he seems to be standing in front of a wall and that there seems to be perhaps water and a sky behind him. But that's not really what they're interested in about this painting, and I have to agree. The thing that's interesting about this painting is that there's a man in a city suit with an apple hanging in front of his face, an unexplained apple. Eventually, people look at the title of the painting, The Son of Man. That's a phrase from the Bible. And for people who know that, that begins to give the painting religious overtones. They may begin to speculate. Maybe the apple is the apple from the Garden of Eden, from the Tree of Knowledge. Maybe the apple represents temptation. And then they begin to speculate philosophically about whether the man will yield to the temptation or whether he's hiding behind the apple because he's already yielded and he's ashamed of yielding to temptation. So people begin to tell themselves a story, in other words, about the painting and about the images that are in it. And I think that's what Magritte wanted. Magritte was a very, very competent painter, but there's nothing special about his brushwork. And I think that's absolutely intentional. He paints very, very dryly. He's one of the few painters that I would say you actually get very much of what his paintings are about by looking at them in reproduction. Because when you look at them in person, there's nothing flashy about the brushwork, nothing expressive. You don't get that feeling that he's here in the room with me, like you do when you look at a Van Gogh exhibition. It's much more about the imagery. He doesn't want to distract you with his flashy brushwork. He doesn't want to make you think of him, Magritte, the artist, standing there in the studio putting paint on the canvas. He wants you to think about his images and what they might mean. Last but not least, I'm going to look at a couple of Picassos. Picasso, of course, handled abstraction and imagery in many, many different ways throughout a long and glorious career. If you look at Picasso's from different periods of his life, you will see such an exploratory and expressive use of this dialectic between abstraction and representation. He kept trying things, he kept experimenting. In this particular period of his work, mid-30s, 1930s, often referred to as synthetic cubism, he approached painting a model, for example, as he did this woman, by painting many of the features several times so that you'll see places in the painting where it looks like there's a nose or another nose, where eyes might be looked at from different points of view, where you might see a profile of the painting of the model in one place and a full-on view of the model in another place, where he hasn't tried to depict the woman the way you'd see a woman in real life. And you have to imagine that when the model stepped around the canvas to see what she looked like in the painting, she would had to have been pretty surprised unless she was very familiar with Picasso's current work, because he's gone way beyond depiction. This is clearly a woman. The title says Weeping Woman, and most people see a weeping woman here. Most people say that they think this is a tear. Some people say that this is a handkerchief or a Kleenex that the woman is biting or wiping her face with. Some people say that this is a hand. Some people say that this is a hand. Some people say that this white area is a transparent handkerchief that's been applied over her face. But it's really a little bit hard to say exactly what we're seeing in each feature. And yet we do get a strong feeling that this is a woman, and we get, I think, a very strong feeling of her grief, her anguish. She's not just getting sentimental in a movie. She's obviously very, very grief-stricken. And we feel her anguish, perhaps, in a way that we wouldn't if Picasso had just painted her a little bit more representationally, right? Take a look at another Picasso here. This would have been painted about, 20 years or so, possibly even more like 10 or 15 years after the Cézannes that we looked at. And already you can see how far painters felt they could go, up until Picasso painted this painting of the young ladies of Avignon. Paintings of women tended to be about beauty. They tended to be very, very representational and to emphasize the beauty of the models. Picasso was the first to really say, no, there are young women in this painting, but this painting is not about their beauty. What is the painting about? Picasso is not making that easy for us. And I would challenge you to open yourself up to this painting, which, as you can imagine, was in its day a fairly horrifying image to many of the people who saw it first, now considered to be a great painting of the world because of the courage and the freedom and the exploration that drove the painter to paint these images. So, abstraction and representation, two ends of a continuum, you could say, and yet obviously it's much more complicated than that. It's a multi-dimensional continuum that gives artists the ability to push even their representational work in many, many expressive directions, including some that approach pure abstraction. And of course, it's also possible to work purely abstractly. And that's what I'd like you to challenge yourself to do for assignment 2 in your sketches. In at least some, I'd like you really to try to leave behind representation of any specific images and work purely abstractly. I think you'll get the most out of this assignment if you can try that. Good luck, and get to work on those sketches. We'll see you for the next lecture.